The Supermarine Spitfire was a dancer, the P-51 Mustang was a racehorse, but the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a linebacker in the sky, a 7-ton monster of aluminum and steel that defied every convention of aerial warfare. In 1941, the prevailing wisdom held that a fighter plane needed to be light, agile, and delicate to survive the dogfights of the modern age. The Thunderbolt shattered that illusion with brute force. It arrived on the tarmac not to outmaneuver the enemy, but to overwhelm them. But in the unforgiving theater of Europe, elegance often bled. Survival required armor, and victory required the ability to deliver destruction on a massive scale. At the war perspective, we believe the best way to honor the past is to never let it be forgotten. If you believe in that mission, hit the subscribe button and join us on this journey. Now let us return to the skies over Europe. To understand how this behemoth became the scourge of the German Panzer divisions, one must first understand its anatomy. The P-47 was not designed, it was built around an engine. Alexander Kartveli, the chief engineer at Republic Aviation, looked at the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower radial beast, and decided to wrap an airframe around it. The result was massive. When fully loaded, the P-47 weighed over 17,000 pounds. It was twice the weight of a Spitfire and significantly heavier than the German bombers it would eventually hunt down. When American pilots first laid eyes on it, they were skeptical. They walked around the fuselage, dwarfed by the massive four-bladed propeller, and wondered how such a thing could possibly stay airborne. They called it the Jug, short for juggernaut, though some claimed it was because its profile resembled a milk jug. The nickname stuck, and it fit the aircraft's personality perfectly. It was not pretty. It was thick-bodied and rugged, with a cockpit that felt more like a roomy sedan than a fighter plane. RAF pilots, accustomed to the tight, responsive controls of their interceptors, initially mocked the American arrival. They joked that the pilot could run around the cockpit to dodge bullets. But the laughter died down the moment they saw what the Thunderbolt could do when the throttle was pushed forward. While it struggled to outclimb the lighter German Messerschmitts, the Thunderbolt possessed a terrifying advantage: gravity. Its immense weight gave it a dive speed that was virtually unmatched. When a P-47 pilot pushed the nose down, the aircraft dropped like a safe full of lead. No German fighter could escape it in a dive without risking structural failure. This kinetic energy, combined with the raw power of the double wasp engine, allowed American pilots to dictate the terms of engagement. They could swoop down from high altitudes, unleash a torrent of fire, and zoom back up before the enemy could react. The firepower itself was staggering. The wings housed 850 caliber machine guns. When fired simultaneously, they unleashed nearly 100 rounds per second. This was not a weapon designed for precision fencing. It was a chainsaw. The recoil was so significant that it could stall the plane in midair if the airspeed was too low. But for the targets caught in the convergence zone of those 8 guns, the effect was catastrophic. Initially, the Army Air Forces deployed the Thunderbolt as a high-altitude escort. Its job was to protect the B-17s and B-24s as they hammered German industry. It performed this role admirably, using its turbo supercharger to fight effectively in the thin air at 30,000 feet. It swept the skies clear of the Luftwaffe, proving that a heavy fighter could win against lighter opponents through energy, tactics, and durability. However, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed the equation. The Mustang had the range to fly deep into Berlin and back, a feat the thirsty Thunderbolt struggled to match without cumbersome drop tanks. By early 1944, the strategic landscape shifted. The Mustang took over the long-range escort duties, leaving the P-47 squadrons searching for a new purpose. Commanders looked at the aircraft's specifications again. They saw a plane that was incredibly stable as a gun platform. They saw an air-cooled radial engine that could take a bullet and keep running, unlike the fragile liquid-cooled engines of the Mustang or Spitfire. And they saw a frame strong enough to carry a payload that rivaled light bombers. The very attributes that made it a questionable dogfighter, its weight, its size, its durability, were the exact qualities needed for a different kind of war. The Thunderbolt was about to descend from the stratosphere to the treetops, where it would meet the iron fist of the German army. The transition was not merely a change in altitude, it was a fundamental shift in the nature of the war. At 30,000 feet, the air was thin, cold, and eerily silent until the guns fired. The combat was mathematical, a calculation of deflection angles and climb rates against a backdrop of endless blue. But as the P-47 squadrons nosed down toward the French countryside in the spring of 1944, they entered a chaotic, blurred world where death came at 350 miles per hour. The Jug pilots, once the guardians of the heavy bombers, found themselves transformed into hunters seeking prey among the hedgerows and highways of occupied Europe. This descent was driven by necessity. By this stage of the conflict, the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death. The relentless pressure of the Allied daylight bombing campaign had decimated the German fighter force. Enemy pilots were scarce, fuel was scarce, and the skies over the invasion beaches had to be swept clean. With fewer Messerschmitts rising to challenge them, thousands of Allied fighters roamed the skies with full ammunition belts and no aerial targets. The command came down to unleash this surplus of violence upon the ground. The directive was simple: destroy anything that moved, anything that supported the German war machine. For the pilots, this new mission required a complete rewiring of their instincts. In aerial combat, the horizon was the reference point. In ground attack, the reference point was a tree line rushing up to meet the propeller. They learned to read the landscape not for beauty, but for tactical significance. A break in the foliage might hide a supply truck. A shadow that didn't move with the sun might be the barrel of a Tiger tank. The P-47, with its expansive cockpit and high seating position, offered excellent visibility for this lethal sightseeing. Pilots began to fly on the deck, skimming just yards above the grass, to surprise German convoys before the flak crews could crank their guns around. The Germans called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber or fighter bombers. It was a term spoken with a mixture of hatred and dread. For years, the Wehrmacht had operated under the protective umbrella of their own air force, the Stukas and Heinkels clearing the path for their Panzer divisions. Now the tables turned with brutal finality. German tank commanders, veterans of the Eastern Front, who were accustomed to dominating the battlefield, found themselves looking up in fear. The psychological shift was profound. A tank crew in a Panzer IV felt invincible against infantry, but against a 7-ton aircraft diving at terminal velocity, they were sitting in a steel coffin. This tactical shift revealed the P-47's greatest hidden asset, its air-cooled radial engine. This was the specific engineering nuance that allowed the Thunderbolt to survive where others perished. The P-51 Mustang, for all its sleek beauty, utilized a liquid-cooled engine. If a single stray bullet from a German rifle pierced the Mustang's radiator, the coolant drained, the engine seized, and the pilot became a prisoner of war. The Thunderbolt had no radiator. It relied on the rush of air over its cylinders to keep cool. A P-47 could take a hit directly to a cylinder head, lose a chunk of its engine, and keep thundering forward. It was a tractor with wings, capable of absorbing punishment that would shred a lesser aircraft. As the invasion of Normandy approached, The Thunderbolt squadrons began a systematic dismantling of the transportation network in northern France. They started with locomotives, blowing steam boilers apart with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. They strafed barges and supply depots. But the ultimate prize, the target that every pilot coveted, was the armor. The German Panzer divisions were the backbone of the defensive line. If the Allies landed on the beaches, it would be the Panzers that rushed to push them back into the sea. The Thunderbolt's job was to ensure those tanks never arrived. However, machine guns alone were often insufficient against the thick hide of a Panther or Tiger tank. Bullets could disable a tread or ignite a fuel drum strapped to the rear, but to crack the heavy armor of the Wehrmacht's finest, the Thunderbolt needed more than just kinetic energy. It needed high explosives. The pilots needed tools that could turn a near miss into a kill. And so, ground crews began hanging ordnance on the wings of the Jug that turned the fighter into a flying artillery battery. The era of the pure dogfighter was over. The age of the tactical strike aircraft had begun. The transformation of the P-47 from a fighter to a ground attack devastator required a serious upgrade in lethal hardware. While the 850 caliber machine guns were devastating against soft targets like trucks and infantry, the German Panzerwaffe was built of hardened steel. To crack the shell of a Tiger or Panther tank, the Thunderbolt needed to punch well above its weight class. The solution came in the form of rockets and bombs, turning the Jug into the most heavily armed single-engine fighter of the war. The most iconic addition was the unguided rocket. Initially, American forces experimented with the M8 rocket tubes, which looked like bundles of bazookas strapped under the wings. They were effective, but they added tremendous drag, slowing the plane down. The real game-changer arrived with the introduction of the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, or HVIR. These were aptly nicknamed Holy Moses by the pilots who first saw them fired. They were 5 inches in diameter, 6 feet long, and packed with 45 pounds of high explosive. A P-47 could carry up to 10 of these under its wings. When a pilot fired a salvo of HVRs, it was comparable to the broadside of a light cruiser. The rockets accelerated to over 1,000 miles per hour, streaking toward the target with a flat trajectory. A direct hit from a Holy Moses could blow the turret off a Panzer IV or shatter the suspension of a Tiger. Even a near miss delivered a concussive shock wave capable of concussing the crew inside and stripping away external equipment. The pilots did not need to be snipers. They just needed to be close. The sheer volume of fire compensated for the lack of guidance systems. In addition to rockets, the Thunderbolt became a premier bomb truck. The airframe was so robust it could lift a payload that embarrassed dedicated bombers. A standard loadout might include 2 500-pound bombs, one under each wing, plus a 500-pound bomb or a fuel tank on the center line. In some configurations, P-47s hauled 2 1,000-pound bombs. To put this in perspective, the B-17 Flying Fortress, a massive 4-engine heavy bomber, often flew long-range missions with a payload of only 4,000 to 5,000 pounds. A flight of 4 Thunderbolts could drop as much explosive tonnage on a tactical target as a heavy bomber, but with pinpoint delivery accuracy that high-altitude bombing could never achieve. But carrying the weight was only half the equation. Delivering it was an art form. The P-47 pilots developed a technique known as glide bombing. They would approach the target area at a moderate altitude, spot the column of German armor, and roll into a shallow dive. Unlike the steep, harrowing dives of the German Stukas, the Thunderbolt pilots maintained a steady, manageable angle. This allowed them to walk their machine gun fire onto the target first. They used the tracers from their .50 calibers as a visual guide. When the bullets were sparking off the tank's hull, The pilot knew his aim was true. He would release the bombs or fire the rockets, then pull back hard on the stick. The release of the ordnance had an immediate physical effect on the aircraft. Freed from thousands of pounds of drag and dead weight, the Thunderbolt would leap upward, the engine roaring as it regained its agility. Behind them, the earth erupted. The combination of fragmentation bombs, high explosive rockets, and incendiary bullets created a zone of absolute destruction. There was also a more insidious weapon in the arsenal: napalm. While less common in the early stages, by late 1944, P-47s began carrying drop tanks filled with jellied gasoline. When dropped on a convoy, the tanks ruptured and ignited, spreading a blanket of liquid fire that stuck to everything it touched. For tank crews, this was a nightmare. Even if the fire didn't penetrate the armor, it sucked the oxygen out of the air intakes and overheated the engines, immobilizing the vehicle. The psychological terror of fire was a potent weapon in its own right. This arsenal meant that a single squadron of 16 P-47s could unleash a storm of violence comprising thousands of armor-piercing bullets, dozens of heavy rockets, and tons of high explosives in a matter of seconds. They didn't just attack targets, they erased grid squares. The German convoys, once the predators of the European battlefield, were forced to hide in forests during the day, moving only under the cover of darkness. The Jug had closed the roads of Europe. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was distinctive. It did not whine like the Messerschmitts or drone like the heavy bombers high above. It growled. It was a deep, guttural vibration that could be felt in the chest before the aircraft was even visible. For the German soldiers on the ground, this sound became the herald of doom. By the summer of 1944, a specific neurosis had taken hold of the Wehrmacht, a condition born from the absolute helplessness of fighting an enemy they could not reach. They called it Jabo panic. The psychological impact of the Thunderbolt was perhaps as effective as its high explosive rockets. War is a contest of wills, and the P-47 broke the will of the Panzer crews by stripping away their greatest asset, invincibility. A Tiger tank commander, sitting inside 50 tons of hardened steel, felt like a god on the battlefield. His frontal armor could deflect shells from almost any Allied tank. But against the Thunderbolt, that same tank was nothing more than a metal trap. The pilots knew that the top armor of a tank was its Achilles heel, often only an inch or two thick, designed to stop shrapnel, not armor-piercing rounds or rockets falling from the sky. This vulnerability forced a radical change in German behavior. The German look became a common affliction among the infantry and tanker alike. A nervous, constant glancing upward, scanning the clouds for the glint of silver or olive drab. The roads of Normandy and France, once the arteries of the Blitzkrieg, became dead zones. To drive a column of vehicles in broad daylight was tantamount to suicide. The Thunderbolt squadrons patrolled in armed reconnaissance missions, dividing the map into grids and hunting for anything that cast a shadow. German memoirs from this period reflect a deep, abiding terror. Veterans wrote of the frustration of possessing superior tanks that could not move. They described the agonizing waits in forests, camouflaging their vehicles with branches, hay, and mud, praying that the sun would not reflect off a viewport or a fender. The mighty Panzerwaffe, the force that had swept across Europe, was reduced to hiding in barns and under tree canopies, paralyzed by the threat circling above. Movement was restricted to the night, but even then the pilots dropped flares, turning night into day and continuing the slaughter. When an attack came, it was often sudden and overwhelming. One moment, a convoy would be creeping along a hedgerow. The next, the air would erupt. The P-47s often attacked in pairs or flights of four. The lead element would suppress the flak wagons, the anti-aircraft vehicles that accompanied the tanks, while the trailing aircraft lined up their runs on the armor. For the men inside the tanks, the experience was sensory overload. The sound of bullets hammering the hull was like being inside a bell struck by a sledgehammer. The external equipment, shovels, tracks, stowage bins, was stripped away in seconds. Even if the rockets missed, the concussive force was debilitating. A 500-pound bomb landing 10 yards away could flip a lighter vehicle or shatter the tracks of a heavy tank, leaving it immobilized. An immobilized tank was a dead tank. The crew would have to bail out, exposing themselves to the strafing runs that inevitably followed. The pilots, flying at 300 miles per hour, could not distinguish between a general and a private. They simply fired at the figures fleeing the burning wreckage. The terror was compounded by the Thunderbolt's durability. German flak crews, brave men charged with defending the convoys, found their morale shattered when they scored hits that failed to bring the enemy down. They watched 20mm shells explode against the wings or fuselage of a P-47, only to see the American plane shudder, stabilize, and turn back for another pass. It seemed unnatural. The Luftwaffe fighters they knew were fragile. These American machines seemed possessed of a mechanical immortality. It created a sense of futility. Why fire if the enemy would not fall? This dominance created a rift between the German army and their own air force. Soldiers on the ground grew bitter, scanning the empty skies for the Luftwaffe that never came. The joke circulating in the trenches was grim but accurate. If the plane is silver, it's American. If it's dark, it's British. If it's invisible, it's German. The P-47 had achieved total air supremacy, not just by shooting down enemy planes, but by making the very air above the battlefield a hostile environment for the enemy below. The Panzer divisions were no longer fighting a ground war. They were fighting a war against the sky itself, and it was a war they were losing. In August 1944, the endgame in Normandy arrived. After months of grinding hedgerow warfare, the Allied armies finally broke out, their pincers swinging shut around the German 7th Army. The retreating Wehrmacht, once the disciplined conquerors of Europe, found themselves funneled into a shrinking geographic coffin known as the Falaise Pocket. As the American forces pushed from the south and the British and Canadians squeezed from the north, the escape route for nearly 100,000 German soldiers and their equipment narrowed to a single gap, barely a few miles wide. It became known as the Corridor of Death, and waiting overhead to seal this corridor were the squadrons of the 9th Air Force flying the P-47 Thunderbolt. The geography of the retreat created a target-rich environment that pilots had only ever dreamed of in training simulations. Desperate to escape the encirclement, German commanders ordered a daylight withdrawal. Thousands of vehicles, Tiger tanks, half-tracks, staff cars, horse-drawn supply wagons, and stolen civilian trucks clogged the narrow country lanes. They moved bumper to bumper, a river of steel and desperation flowing east. Traffic jams stretched for miles. When the sun rose and the morning mist burned off, the German columns were exposed, vulnerable, and utterly immobile. The P-47 pilots did not need to hunt. They simply had to choose where to begin. The tactics employed were ruthless and methodical. The flights would identify a long column of vehicles trapped on a single-lane road bordered by ditches or embankments. The lead aircraft would dive and drop its bombs on the first vehicle in the line, turning it into a burning roadblock. The wingman would then strike the last vehicle in the column, trapping everything in between. With the corks firmly in the bottle, the rest of the squadron could take their time. They strafed the immobilized line from end to end. The 50 caliber machine guns tore through canvas covers and thin armor, igniting fuel tanks and ammunition stores. The chain reaction was apocalyptic. Exploding trucks set fire to the trees lining the road, creating a tunnel of flame. Horses stampeded or fell in their harnesses. Tank crews, realizing their 60-ton behemoths were trapped by burning trucks, abandoned their vehicles and fled into the fields, only to be strafed by the next wave of aircraft. The carnage was so intense that the smoke from the burning columns rose thousands of feet into the air, visible to pilots taking off from airfields across the English Channel. It served as a grim beacon, guiding fresh waves of thunderbolts to the slaughter. Pilots reported that the smell of cordite and burning rubber was strong enough to penetrate their oxygen masks at 2,000 feet. Down on the deck, the heat was palpable as they pulled out of their runs. There was no maneuvering, no dogfighting, only the mechanical process of destruction. For the German army, this was the death knell of their organized resistance in France. It wasn't just the loss of men, it was the total annihilation of their material strength. The roads became graveyards of the Panzerwaffe. Hundreds of tanks, irreplaceable marvels of engineering, were left as smoking husks. The P-47s had achieved what ground forces would have taken weeks and thousands of casualties to accomplish. They dismantled an entire army from the air. In the days following the closure of the gap, Allied commanders toured the area. The scenes they witnessed defied description. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who had seen the worst of war, later wrote that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping only on decaying wreckage and flesh. The road surfaces were shattered, the ditches filled with the debris of a defeated army. The terrifying efficiency of the Thunderbolt was laid bare for all to see. It had turned a retreat into a rout, and a rout into a massacre. The victory at Falaise proved that air power could do more than just support the ground war. It could decide it. The P-47 had demonstrated that mass tactical airstrikes could obliterate a heavily armed enemy force before it could even fire a shot in return. The Jug had effectively decapitated the German armored force in the West. As the Allies turned their eyes toward the German border, they moved with the confidence that the sky belonged to them, and that the heavy hammer of the Thunderbolt was ready to fall on anyone who dared to stand in their way. While the pilots inflicted hell on the ground, they were flying through it themselves. The narrative of the Jabo often focuses on the destruction they dealt, but it frequently overlooks the immense danger inherent in low-level ground attack. To kill a tank with machine guns or rockets, a pilot had to fly straight and level directly into the teeth of the enemy's defenses. At 2,000 feet, a pilot was safe from small arms. At 20 feet, every German soldier with a rifle, a machine gun, or a 20mm flak cannon was firing back. The German army was battered, but it was not toothless. They adapted their defenses specifically to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They developed flak traps, positioning rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns in geometric patterns around likely targets. When a P-47 dove to strafe a truck convoy, it would fly into a pre-sighted box of exploding shells. The air was often so thick with tracers that pilots described it as flying into a wall of fire. The distinct thump, thump, thump of rounds hitting the fuselage became the soundtrack of their missions. This environment is where the legend of the P-47's durability moved from theory to reality. Any other aircraft would have crumbled under the punishment the Thunderbolt absorbed daily. There are hundreds of documented cases of P-47s returning to base in conditions that defied the laws of aerodynamics. Pilots brought planes home with cylinders blown off the engine, with holes in the wings big enough for a man to crawl through, and with half the tail section missing. One famous incident involved a pilot who struck a chimney while strafing a train in Germany. He flew through the brickwork, shattering the structure, and yet the Thunderbolt kept flying. Another pilot, blinded by oil from a shattered engine, was talked down to a landing by his wingman. When the ground crews inspected the aircraft, they found over 100 bullet holes and a piece of a telephone pole embedded in the leading edge of the wing. The structural integrity of the jug was not just an engineering feature, it was a life insurance policy. This ruggedness bred a unique confidence in the aviators. A Mustang pilot might think twice about making a third pass on a heavily defended target. A Thunderbolt pilot knew his mount could take the hit. This confidence allowed them to press attacks with a ferocity that terrified the enemy. They would fly so low they returned with tree branches in their air intakes and mud splattered on their windshields. They were not just dropping bombs, they were brawling. However, the cost was steep. The 9th Air Force, which operated the bulk of the tactical P-47 squadrons, suffered some of the highest casualty rates of the war. Flak happy became a term for the combat fatigue that set in after too many missions down in the weeds. Pilots watched their friends explode in midair or cartwheel into the ground at 300 miles per hour. There were no parachutes at that altitude. If the plane went down, the pilot went with it. The danger wasn't only from the enemy. The chaotic nature of low-level flying meant that target identification was split-second work. Friendly fire incidents, while rare, were a haunting reality. In the confusion of battle, with smoke obscuring the lines, American tanks sometimes looked perilously similar to German ones. The burden of this responsibility weighed heavily on the pilots. They had to be executioners, but they had to be precise executioners, operating in a blurred, adrenaline-fueled world where a single mistake meant killing their own countrymen. Despite the losses, the morale remained high because the pilots knew they were making a tangible difference. Every tank they burned was one less obstacle for the infantry. Every train they derailed meant fewer shells falling on Allied lines. They saw the results of their work instantly: the explosion, the fire, the stopped column. It was a visceral, immediate form of warfare that contrasted sharply with the distant, impersonal nature of high-altitude bombing. The bond between the pilot and the plane became almost spiritual. They patted the fuselage after a mission, thanking the machine for bringing them home. They argued fiercely with mechanics to patch up their bird rather than accept a replacement. In the crucible of ground attack warfare, the P-47 ceased to be just a collection of aluminum and rivets. It became a partner, a shield, and the only thing standing between a pilot and a fiery death in a French field. The Thunderbolt didn't just carry weapons. It carried the men who wielded them through the fire, again and again. December 1944 brought a cold to the Ardennes forests that froze oil lines and cracked engine blocks. It was in this frozen, snow-choked landscape that the German army launched its final, desperate gamble in the West. Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. The timing of the offensive was not accidental. It was calculated based on meteorology. The German high command knew they could no longer match the Allies in the air. Their only hope lay in the heavy blanket of fog and low clouds that had settled over Belgium, grounding the Allied air forces. For the first time since the breakout from Normandy, the German Panzer divisions could move in daylight without fear of the Yabos. For the P-47 pilots stationed at forward airfields in France and Belgium, the first week of the battle was a torture of inactivity. They sat in ready rooms, playing endless hands of poker and drinking stale coffee, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. They knew what was happening. They knew the American lines were buckling under the weight of the SS Panzer divisions. Reports trickled in of American units being overrun, of the 101st Airborne surrounded at Bastogne, desperate for support. Yet the Thunderbolt squadrons remained grounded. The fog was so thick that a pilot couldn't see the end of the runway. To fly in such conditions was suicide. The frustration was palpable. They possessed the most destructive tactical weapon of the war, but nature had rendered it useless. Emboldened by the gray skies, the German armor advanced with a swagger they had not felt in months. Massive King Tiger tanks, beasts that outclassed anything the Allies had on the ground, rolled down the narrow roads, crushing jeeps and half-tracks. They pushed deep into the Allied lines, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. The German commanders believed that if they could reach the port of Antwerp before the skies cleared, they could split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. They were racing against the barometer. Then on the morning of December 23rd, the miracle occurred. A high-pressure system from Russia swept across Europe, pushing the fog away. The sun rose over a landscape of blinding white snow and crisp blue sky. On airfields across the region, the order went out immediately. Everything flies. The engines of thousands of P-47s coughed to life, spewing blue smoke into the freezing air. The Hitler weather had broken, and the retribution was about to begin. The scale of the air operations that followed was unprecedented. The 9th Air Force launched devastating sorties from dawn until dusk. As the Thunderbolts arrived over the Ardennes, the pilots looked down to see the German columns exposed against the pristine white snow. There was no camouflage that could hide a dark column of tanks on a white background. The targets were stark, obvious, and plentiful. The P-47s went to work with a fury born of pent-up frustration. They prioritized the German supply lines. The German offensive was a gas-guzzling beast. The heavy Tigers and Panthers consumed fuel at an alarming rate. The pilots understood that destroying a fuel truck was as good as destroying a tank. They hunted the winding roads behind the front lines, strafing tankers and supply wagons. When a fuel truck was hit by 50 caliber incendiaries, it didn't just burn, it exploded in a fireball that incinerated everything nearby and blocked the road for hours. At the tip of the German spearhead, the effects were immediate. Panzer commanders, already running low on reserves, looked at their fuel gauges with dread. Without gas, the terrifying King Tiger was nothing more than a 70-ton pillbox. The P-47s hammered the tanks directly as well, skipping bombs into the sides of the vehicles and raining rockets down on the turrets. But the logistical strangulation was the true killing blow. Thousands of German vehicles were abandoned intact, their crews fleeing on foot because their tanks had simply run dry. The psychological impact on the German troops was devastating. They had promised their men that the Luftwaffe would protect them, or at least that the weather would hold. Instead, the sky was filled with the silver shapes of the Thunderbolts. The Jabo panic returned with a vengeance. American ground troops, huddled in their foxholes, cheered as the Thunderbolts roared overhead, dipping their wings before unleashing hell on the ridges ahead. It was the morale boost the beleaguered infantry needed to hold the line. By late December, the German offensive had stalled, choked off by the destruction of its supply arteries, and battered into submission by the relentless air attacks. The P-47 had proven that it was an all-weather warrior, provided the fog lifted just enough to see the ground. The roads of the Ardennes, like the roads of Normandy before them, became a graveyard of German ambition. The gamble had failed. The sun had come out, and with it, the Thunderbolt had returned to finish the job. As the spring of 1945 thawed the frozen ground of Europe, the German war machine was no longer a machine. It was a fragmented, immobile wreck. The Allies crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of the Reich, and the P-47 Thunderbolt led the vanguard. By this stage, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. The skies were empty of enemy fighters, allowing the Thunderbolt squadrons to roam with absolute impunity. They became the roving eyes and the long-range artillery of the advancing armored columns. The pilots were often in direct radio contact with the tank commanders on the ground, directing fire and clearing obstacles miles ahead of the front line. The statistics of destruction wrought by the 9th Air Force were staggering, almost difficult to comprehend. Post-war analysis and surveys of the battlefields painted a picture of industrial-scale annihilation. Between D-Day and VE Day, tactical air power, with the P-47 as its primary instrument, was credited with the destruction of roughly 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 motor trucks. While these numbers are estimates and debates over specific claims continue, the physical reality on the ground was undeniable. The German army in the West did not run out of tanks. It ran out of the ability to move them, fuel them, and hide them. The final battles in the Ruhr pocket were a turkey shoot. German columns trying to retreat into the crumbling interior were caught in the open and obliterated. The roads leading to Berlin were lined with the blackened skeletons of the Wehrmacht's equipment. The P-47 had effectively demechanized the German army. Toward the end, the once proud Panzer divisions were reduced to using oxen and horses to pull their remaining artillery, only to be strafed by the relentless silver birds. The technological gap had become a chasm. One side was fighting a modern war of maneuver with air superiority, while the other was reduced to a pre-industrial struggle for survival. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt is unique in the annals of aviation history. It never achieved the glamorous fame of the P-51 Mustang. It was not the plane that starred in the newsreels doing victory rolls over the airfield. It was the workhorse, the mud mover, the blue-collar fighter that did the dirty, dangerous work down in the weeds. The pilots of the P-47s did not seek to become aces. They sought to break things. Their scoreboard was not measured in swastikas painted on the fuselage, but in the gratitude of the infantrymen who watched them level a stubborn pillbox or silence a mortar crew. For the men on the ground, the Jug was the most beautiful plane in the sky. When an American GI heard the roar of that double Wasp engine, he knew that help had arrived. He knew that for the next few minutes, the enemy would be keeping their heads down. The bond between the Thunderbolt squadrons and the ground forces was forged in the fire of close air support, a doctrine that the P-47 perfected. It proved that an air force could be more than a strategic hammer striking distant factories. It could be a tactical scalpel, intimately involved in the minute-by-minute struggle of the battlefield. As the war ended, the jet age dawned, and the massive, propeller-driven fighters were quickly rendered obsolete. The P-47s were scrapped in droves, melted down to build the appliances and automobiles of the post-war boom. But the lessons learned in the cockpits of the Thunderbolt shaped the future of warfare. The concept of the heavy, durable ground attack aircraft lived on, influencing the design of future legends like the A-10 Warthog. The P-47 had demonstrated that survivability and payload were just as important as speed and maneuverability. It showed that sometimes the best way to win a fight is not to dance around the opponent, but to hit them with a sledgehammer. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a triumph of function over form. It was not built to inspire poetry. It was built to inflict punishment. Its story is the story of the Allied war effort itself, massive, industrial, overpowering, and relentless. It took the best technology of the enemy and crushed it under the weight of superior logistics and overwhelming firepower. The Panzer divisions, the terrified elite of the German army, learned too late that their thick armor offered no protection against the sky. The legacy of the Thunderbolt lies not just in the scrap metal it left on the roads of France, but in the lives it saved. Every tank destroyed from the air was a battle that American infantry did not have to fight. Every supply truck burned was a shell that was never fired at Allied troops. The Jug was a guardian angel with an iron hide, a machine that proved that when the cause is just, even the ugliest weapon can be a thing of beauty. And that is why these tales must be told.